What would you do if you discovered that your entire life was built on a lie? Could you face the truth if the person you cherished most held a secret capable of shattering everything? In this true crime story, we look into the chilling tale of a husband who uncovers a devastating truth about his wife, one that leads to a gruesome and violent murder. The Newlywed's discovery was so dark and shocking that it resulted in one of the most horrifying crimes the city had ever witnessed. This isn't just a tale of hidden secrets or lost trust. It's the story of a marriage that descended into unimaginable terror. Welcome to Forbidden Passion. I am glad to have you join us on another video. Kindly subscribe, like, and share. Let me know where you're watching from. James met Maria on a rainy Sunday afternoon at a local community event hosted by their church. He was there with a few friends, his typical reserved self, but Maria immediately stood out. She was beautiful, with a warm smile and a gentle laugh that seemed to fill the room. James was drawn to her kindness and grace, and their connection felt instant, like a meeting of two souls long destined for one another. They began talking and discovered a shared love for faith, family, and a longing for a committed partnership. For James, Maria felt like the embodiment of everything he had waited for. As the months passed, they grew closer, their bond deepening through conversations about their hopes and dreams. They spoke at length about the life they envisioned together, a marriage built on love, trust, and faith. James would often say, with a smile, that they were going to have the kind of marriage that people prayed for. Maria would nod in agreement, her eyes shining with warmth as she imagined a future filled with joy and support. They spoke of building a home filled with laughter, and of one day raising children who would grow up with the same values they held dear. James had always been a man of unwavering principles, shaped by his strict religious upbringing and the resolute moral compass he carried into adulthood. At 28, he was still a virgin, a fact he wore with quiet pride. He'd waited, holding fast to his belief that love, marriage, and physical intimacy were sacred acts, to be shared only within the bounds of holy matrimony. Their engagement was a time of blissful anticipation, a shared journey toward a future that felt both thrilling and comforting. They talked about the milestones they would celebrate together, from anniversaries to family gatherings to growing old side by side. Their love, James believed, was rooted in the kind of mutual respect and understanding that would make them strong, unshakable. As their wedding day approached, he felt certain that his prayers had been answered, that Maria was the answer he had been waiting for, and that their marriage would be the culmination of everything he had hoped for. As they exchanged vows, James promised to love, honor, and protect Maria for the rest of his life. He couldn't have been more hopeful for their future. They moved into a cozy house, a space filled with wedding gifts, their favorite books, and plans for a life that reflected their shared faith. Yet amid this hope, neither could imagine the dark secrets that lay just ahead, secrets that would lead to an unimaginable outcome. The first weeks of their marriage should have been blissful, a time for passion and the beginning of shared memories. James approached their honeymoon with eager anticipation, having waited years for this moment, preserving himself for the sanctity of marriage. Their private getaway to a beach resort was everything he had dreamed of in its simplicity. Sunsets over the ocean, laughter during long walks on the shore, and quiet dinners where they spoke about the life ahead. Yet behind these idyllic scenes, something unsettling stirred. When night fell and James reached out for Maria, the responses he received were unexpectedly restrained. Though she welcomed his touch, there was a hesitation, a barely perceptible tension in her body that made each moment feel stilted. Their first night together felt awkward, lacking the flow he had envisioned after years of imagining what intimacy would be like. Maria's smile would falter just briefly, replaced by a flicker of something he couldn't identify. When they were finally together, it was brief and mechanical, as though Maria were holding something back, her body stiff and movements deliberate. James found himself lying awake afterward, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of why it all felt so different from what he had imagined. Over time, James tried to be patient and understanding, convincing himself that marriage came with an adjustment period. But the discomfort lingered. and the moments they spent together felt increasingly forced. Maria would frequently initiate passionate kisses, only to pull away with a sudden excuse: headaches, exhaustion from work, or needing a moment to breathe. When they did come together physically, there was a detachment in her eyes, a flicker of pain that quickly vanished, but left an imprint on James's heart. Each time he felt more confused, more disappointed, unable to shake the feeling that the depth he longed for was just out of reach. Conversations about their physical relationship grew strained. James would bring it up gently, hoping to bridge the gap between them. "Is everything okay? Do you need time?" he would ask, his voice soft but laced with underlying worry. Maria would always respond with a practiced smile, brushing his concerns aside with reassurances that didn't match the sadness in her eyes. "It's just the stress of work, love," she'd say. But deep down, James felt as though they were skirting around a truth that remained stubbornly out of sight, a shadow in the corners of their happiness. The cracks in their marriage widened as time went on. While James poured himself into their relationship, hoping persistence and love would bridge the growing gap, Maria's distance only deepened. Conversations about intimacy became arguments. James questioned why their connection felt stifled, why Maria's body always seemed to hold tension when they were close. Her answers were vague, claiming stress from work or simply needing time to feel truly at home in their life together. James felt a pang of guilt. Maybe he was expecting too much too soon. But the guilt twisted into confusion when Maria began avoiding conversations altogether. She stayed late at work more often, her excuses piling up. James's friends and family began noticing the strain, offering kind words about patience and understanding. But their reassurances did little to soothe the doubt gnawing at him from within. James's sense of disquiet evolved into an unshakable feeling of suspicion as the months passed. Each attempt at intimacy carried an air of unease that he couldn't ignore, and Maria's habitual hesitance only made things worse. The nights he longed to connect with her often ended with her pulling back at the last moment. Sometimes she claimed exhaustion, and other times she used vague excuses that left James bewildered and hurt. Even when they managed to be intimate, there was a strange detachment on her part, as if she was performing a role rather than sharing a moment with her husband. The passion James had anticipated for so long felt muted and forced, and it wasn't just the absence of joy, it was the palpable tension. Her reluctance was not what he had imagined from marriage, and it left him questioning what was wrong. Over time, doubt crept into his thoughts during quiet moments, when he caught her staring into the distance, or when she avoided eye contact after another half-hearted embrace. Despite his attempts to dismiss these feelings as normal adjustments in a marriage, a gnawing voice in the back of his mind whispered that there was more to the story. The revelation came during an evening that began like any other, a small gathering with friends filled with laughter, music, and shared memories. James sat with a strained smile, his mind distracted by the growing distance between him and Maria. He watched her move around the room, interacting with guests, laughter in her voice, but a certain guardedness in her eyes that only he seemed to notice. It was then that an old college friend of Maria's, a woman named Laura, joined the conversation and began flipping through photos on her phone, showing off memories of their college years. James leaned in to look, curiosity momentarily eclipsing his unease. Laura's voice was light as she recounted stories from their college days, pointing out old friends in group photos. Then, in passing, Laura mentioned, "Oh, and there's Mark. Gosh, he was such a character back then, wasn't he, Maria?" The air seemed to thicken instantly. Maria's smile faltered for just a second, her eyes wide and panicked before she forced a laugh and quickly shifted the topic to something trivial. But the moment wasn't lost on James. An unexplainable chill ran down James's spine. The name Mark echoed in his mind, connecting dots he didn't know were there. He stole a glance at Maria, who had turned away, engaged in conversation with someone else, avoiding his gaze. James's thoughts tumbled in on themselves, forming a knot in his chest. Who was Mark, and why had Maria never mentioned him before? Why did the mention of this name bring such fear to her eyes? The laughter and conversation around him seemed muffled, drowned out by the questions hammering in his mind. That night, after the guests left, James couldn't let it go. Maria was quiet, almost too eager to go to bed and put the evening behind them. But as she settled under the covers and turned away, James sat in the darkened living room, a sense of dread gripping him. He picked up his phone, fingers shaking as he started typing "Mark" alongside the town where Maria had gone to college. What he found were older photos on social media, half-buried articles, and public records that hinted at something far bigger than he had imagined. A single grainy photo finally made his heart pound in his chest. A young man with eyes strikingly similar to Maria's, a ghost of familiarity staring back at him through the screen. James continued digging, piecing together a fragmented past Maria had carefully concealed. There, laid bare in the cold, unfeeling text of medical reports and legal documents, was the truth. Maria had once been Mark. She had undergone gender reassignment surgery and legally changed her identity before they met. The shock hit him with the force of a physical blow, leaving him gasping for air. The woman he thought he knew, the life they had built, suddenly everything felt like a carefully constructed lie. The hours following James's initial discovery were a blur, marked by disbelief, anger, and confusion. The soft glow of his phone screen illuminated his face as he scrolled through page after page of search results, unable to tear his eyes away. The weight of each new piece of evidence settled like a stone in his stomach. He stared at an old photo of Maria before her transition, with a mix of horror and sadness. The resemblance was undeniable, the familiar curve of the jaw, the same deep eyes that once captivated him. But how could this be true? How had he not seen it before? The deeper James delved, the more the puzzle pieces clicked into place. Old articles and social media snippets revealed Maria's journey, from her struggle with gender dysphoria to her eventual decision to transition. There were anecdotes about the isolation she faced, the courage it took to start anew, and the surgery that had changed her life. It was a story of transformation and resilience, one that painted Maria as someone who fought to live authentically. But to James, in that moment, it felt like a betrayal of unimaginable proportions. He sat back on the couch, eyes burning and hands trembling as the first light of dawn crept through the blinds. The reality of the situation began to settle in. Maria had chosen to hide a fundamental part of herself, a truth that could have changed everything for James had he known before their marriage. He thought about their wedding vows, spoken with love and faith, promises that now felt tainted by the secret she'd kept. All the small moments that had seemed strange now fell into place. Her reluctance for deep intimacy, the careful avoidance of certain conversations, the hesitation in her eyes whenever he had mentioned children. The betrayal cut deeper than anything James had ever known. He had married Maria under the belief that they shared the same values, the same openness and honesty that he held dear. Now, he felt like a fool, blindsided by a truth he hadn't even known to look for. The mixture of shame and fury churned in his gut, eating away at the man he thought he was. He stood up, the room spinning around him as he paced back and forth, raking his hands through his hair. The silence of the house, once comforting, now felt oppressive, pressing down on him like a suffocating weight. James's mind flashed to their wedding day, Maria's radiant smile as she said, "I promise to always love you." He had believed it then, believing that what they shared was sacred. But now, with the truth out in the open, he felt robbed, deceived, and mocked. His trust, his beliefs, the foundation of their relationship, it all seemed like a cruel illusion. The anger bubbled up inside him, toxic and uncontrollable. He needed answers, and he knew that he would have to confront Maria to get them. But the thought of looking her in the eyes, of asking her why she had kept such an essential part of herself hidden, made his throat tighten with a mix of rage and unspeakable grief. With his heart pounding and rage simmering just beneath the surface, James confronted Maria. His voice trembled with anger and hurt as he demanded answers. Maria's face turned pale, eyes wide with the fear of a long-held secret laid bare. She tried to explain, to tell him how hard it was to live with the fear of losing him, and how much she loved him despite everything. Tears streamed down her face as she recounted her decision to transition and the courage it had taken to rebuild her life. But her words fell on deaf ears. James was too consumed by betrayal to hear her truth. He felt a tide of rage rising, uncontrollable and suffocating. James's mind was a battlefield of emotions as he paced the living room, Maria's confession ringing in his ears. Her tearful words about her journey and the reasons she kept her secret replayed in fragments, fueling his anger and heartbreak. He felt like a fool, betrayed by the very person he had vowed to protect and love. The woman he had shared his life with had become a stranger in an instant, a stranger who had upended his reality and faith. The room around him blurred as his vision clouded with rage, every pulse in his body demanding an outlet for the betrayal he felt so deeply. Maria stood in the corner, trembling and sobbing, pleading for understanding and forgiveness. "James, please, I wanted to tell you so many times. I was afraid of losing you," she whispered, voice choked with fear and regret. But James couldn't hear her through the roar of betrayal that filled his head. His chest heaved as he shouted back, voice hoarse and breaking. "You lied to me. You took everything I believed in and shattered it." The air between them was thick with the weight of words that couldn't be taken back. Before he could stop himself, James's rage surged forward, overtaking reason. He took a step toward Maria, who instinctively backed away, eyes wide with terror. In that split second, the room seemed to shrink, and time slowed as he reached out and shoved her. The force, born of raw emotion and hurt, sent Maria stumbling backward, arms flailing as she tried to regain balance. Her head struck the corner of the wall with a sickening crack, and then there was silence. The world around James froze, the sound of her impact still echoing in his ears. His breath caught in his chest as he looked down at Maria's motionless body crumpled on the floor, her face pale and lifeless. The anger drained from him as quickly as it had flared, replaced by an icy wave of realization. He fell to his knees beside her, hands trembling as he touched her shoulder. "Maria?" His voice was a hoarse whisper, desperate for any sign of life. But she didn't move, didn't make a sound. The room was swallowed by a silence so deep it felt suffocating. As James knelt beside Maria's lifeless form, the room seemed to shrink around him. Time stretched and bent, seconds turning into what felt like hours as he tried to comprehend the gravity of the moment. His hands trembled as they hovered over her still body, and a cold numbness seeped into his limbs. He felt disconnected from reality, as if watching a horrific scene unfold through someone else's eyes. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint sound of his own ragged breathing. A million thoughts raced through James's mind. His heart thudded in his chest, both fast and uneven, as the realization set in. He had killed Maria. The love of his life, the woman he had sworn to protect, now lay before him, motionless and unresponsive. He replayed the moment in his head, the rage, the shove, the sickening sound of her head hitting the wall. It felt surreal, a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. He wanted to reach out and reverse time, to take back the flash of fury that had obliterated everything in an instant. But it was too late. Suddenly, the distant sound of sirens cut through the suffocating silence. Someone must have heard the shouting and called the police. Panic surged through James, bringing with it an overwhelming tide of guilt and fear. What would he say? How could he explain this? The weight of what he had done pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. The room spun, and he clutched the edge of the coffee table to steady himself, eyes still locked on Maria. Tears burned his eyes, but they didn't fall. They seemed caught behind the wall of disbelief that had built itself in his chest. The sirens grew louder, closing in, and James knew he had no time to think or act. He sat back, hands falling limply to his sides as he accepted that the life he knew was over. The door burst open moments later, officers rushing in, their voices sharp and commanding. James didn't move, didn't resist as they pulled him to his feet and cuffed his wrists. He was barely aware of them reading his rights, their words muffled and far away. His gaze lingered on Maria as they led him out, and he felt the last remnants of his old life slip away. As they pushed him into the back of the police car, the reality of his situation settled like a stone in his gut. Maria was gone, and he was responsible. The enormity of that truth crushed him, leaving a hollow ache that would stay with him for the rest of his life. James knew that from this point on, there was no redemption, no path to undo what had been done. He was no longer the man he once believed himself to be. He was something else entirely, a stranger to himself, marked forever by the dark decision he made in a moment of rage. James sat motionless in the back of the police car, the cold metal of the handcuffs biting into his wrists, grounding him in the terrifying reality of the moment. His mind, clouded and heavy, couldn't seem to focus on anything but the last few moments he had shared with Maria, the way her eyes had pleaded for understanding and the hollow thud as her head hit the wall. The officers spoke in clipped tones outside the vehicle, their voices too low for him to make out, but the urgency was clear. This was no longer a misunderstanding or a marital spat. It was a crime scene, and he was the one who had created it. After days of agonizing deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict. James was found guilty of manslaughter. His sentence reflected the complexity of the case, acknowledging the emotional turmoil he had endured, yet condemning the violent outcome that had claimed Maria's life. The judge, stern yet solemn, addressed James before pronouncing the sentence, speaking to the severity of his actions and the tragic loss that had left a permanent scar on both families. The judge explained that while James's feelings of betrayal and emotional shock were undeniable, they could never justify taking a life. He emphasized that Maria's past, though hidden, did not diminish her right to live freely and honestly in her own truth. James received a sentence of 15 years with the possibility of parole after 10. A judgment meant to provide some justice for Maria while acknowledging James's own psychological struggle.